John Lashitsky has just been released from prison after his third stint. Since childhood, he's been drawn to the dark side. 8 years ago, John was driving a van carrying a massive lottery check, but he never got to cash it. The judge pronounced him guilty, declaring,
"Society needs to be protected from worthless scum like you."
John was sentenced to 7 years in a juvenile facility. This harsh sentence turned him into a desperate criminal. At 18, John tried to rob mail carriers but emptied his gun while attempting to intimidate them. He received a 4-year sentence. The judge even remarked that if stupidity were a crime, John would have gotten a life sentence. 6 months after serving his term, the same judge sent John back to prison for car theft. Upon his release, John decided to take revenge on the judge, but the man had passed away 3 days earlier. Frustrated, John shot up a phone booth in anger. At a bar, he came across an article stating that the judge's son, Nelson Biederman, was opening a memorial. John saw this as an opportunity for revenge. While Nelson delivered a speech, John broke into his car, stealing change, emptying an inhaler, and even spitting into Nelson's coffee. Twice. Nelson turned out to be an entitled jerk who squandered money and yelled at the directors of his father's foundation. John tailed him, watching closely. Nelson, an asthmatic, frantically searched for a new inhaler after discovering his was empty. He stormed into a pharmacy, knocking over shelves in a panic. The store owner shouted,
"Thief!"
while his wife muttered,
"Another junkie."
Nelson finally found an inhaler, but the shopkeeper and his wife mistook him for an armed robber. Chaos erupted as John added fuel to the fire, firing his gun. The shopkeeper's wife retaliated by shooting Nelson with a shotgun. The entire incident was caught on camera. The board of directors, fed up with Nelson, refused to help him, claiming legal advice suggested he plead guilty. Nelson, abandoned, faced trial. At court, John sat among the audience. Nelson, leaning on his father's reputation, hoped to manipulate the judge. Unfortunately for him, the judge despised people like him and insisted the trial follow the law. Nelson's fate rested in the hands of a jury whom he deemed a group of idiots. Not far from the truth. Nelson's attorney, Dwayne, delivered an absurd defense, referencing films like Jurassic Park. The jury found Nelson guilty of attempted robbery, sentencing him to 3 to 5 years at Rosemore Prison. John imagined the wealthy brat being beaten and abused in prison, but found little satisfaction. He wanted to cause Nelson pain himself. When 2 undercover cops tried to buy drugs from John, he pretended not to notice their disguise and willingly got himself arrested. His goal was to be sent to Rosemore to exact his revenge on Nelson. Negotiating with the judge, John ensured his sentence aligned with Nelson's and even requested the same prison. On the prison bus, John immediately struck up a conversation with Nelson, suggesting they share a cell. Grateful for the kindness, Nelson agreed, as other prisoners treated him coldly. The prison warden, introducing himself to the new inmates, asked if anyone claimed to be innocent. When one did, he was swiftly struck with a rifle butt. The warden sarcastically advised anyone with complaints to write them down, roll the paper into a tube, and shove it where the sun doesn't shine. John, already familiar with the guards, bribed one to share a cell with Nelson. Meanwhile, Nelson trembled as he walked past shouting inmates, finally reaching his 2-square-meter cell. Sitting on the floor, he burst into tears. John warned Nelson to stop crying before others noticed, or he wouldn't last the week. He demanded Nelson show a ferocious snarl, but Nelson's attempt resembled a constipated grimace. Maintaining a prisoner costs $54 per day in the US, amounting to $28 billion annually. John joked it might be cheaper to let people steal car stereos. In the cafeteria, John pointed out prison dynamics, mentioning Leonard as the dominant figure. He warned Nelson to leave the table by 12:15, but Nelson got distracted reminiscing about his college days. At that moment, right in front of Nelson, Leonard stabbed another inmate. Guard Shanahan hit Leonard and asked who did it. Following John's suggestion, Nelson immediately pointed to Leonard. However, back in the cell, Leonard scolded him, saying,
"In prison, you don't snitch."
One of the more interesting places in prison is the shower. A burly inmate named Barry took a liking to the new guy, Nelson, and started flirting with him. But John claimed Nelson as his own, threatening another prisoner with a shiv and declaring,
"Access to this little white butt is off limits to anyone else."
Nelson thanked John awkwardly, but was horrified by what prison life demanded. As Nelson processed the harsh realities, his lawyer explained that he had no access to the funds in his father's foundation, as he had been suspended as chairman while serving his sentence. John, meanwhile, bribed one inmate to constantly punch Nelson in the face and another in the cafeteria to slip disgusting things into his food. In the showers, Barry continued to torment Nelson. The big guy was so enamored that he offered to buy Nelson at any price. Eventually, Barry set up a private encounter. Guard Shanahan called John out for trash duty and deliberately left Nelson's cell unlocked. Other inmates quickly grabbed Nelson, put a bag over his head, and dragged him to a room decorated with candles and garlands. Barry entered, offering Nelson some wine he had brewed in a toilet. However, things turned darker as Barry pressed a knife to Nelson's throat when he lied about Barry's weight. Barry, who despised dishonesty, declared that Nelson was now his property. He told Nelson he would have to please him, but promised to take things slow. Barry even leaned in for a romantic nose rub, saying they'd start with a kiss. Later, as Nelson wrote to his pen pal, who turned out to be a young boy, an Aryan Brotherhood member urinated on him. This was a message from Leonard, who had just been released from solitary confinement. John informed Nelson that other inmates were placing bets on where Leonard would kill him. Naive as ever, Nelson approached Leonard to apologize, but Leonard immediately stabbed him in the leg with a fork. Leonard revealed that Nelson had offended him just as much as his own father had, and he had killed his father in the same way he intended to kill Nelson. Meanwhile, Barry continued to show his affections. John suggested Nelson hide from Leonard in solitary confinement. To get him there, John stood behind Nelson and punched a guard. The plan worked, and Nelson was sent to solitary. However, as time dragged on, Nelson began to suffer from hallucinations and isolation. After just 2 days, Nelson had enough and sought out the prison's chemist to buy something to end his life. The chemist sold him boat cleaner and a syringe. Nelson confided his plan to his pen pal, expressing his rage by saying he wanted to line up his tormentors and cut off their manhoods. Unbeknownst to him, his young pen pal read the letter aloud to his entire class. Soon after, Leonard stormed into Nelson's cell, doused him with gasoline, and lamented that Nelson wasn't Jewish, as it would have made burning him alive more satisfying. Surprisingly, Nelson fought back, injuring Leonard. During the struggle, Leonard mistook the syringe of boat cleaner for drugs, injected himself, and immediately dropped dead. John was particularly stunned. This was not part of his plan. From that day forward, Nelson's life in prison took a sharp turn. The Aryan Brotherhood now backed him, and he rose to a position of power, able to order anyone around. However, unresolved romantic matters remained. Barry had fallen in love with Nelson over the months, and his feelings were hurt by Nelson's lack of reciprocation. In an emotional outburst, Barry nearly strangled Nelson in the bathroom. Nelson, feeling guilty for breaking Barry's heart, forgave him. When Aryan Brotherhood members burst into the bathroom to protect Nelson, he stopped them, asking them to leave Barry alone. John accidentally ended up in solitary confinement himself. Upon his release, he discovered that Nelson was now running the entire prison. Nelson had even organized a musical performed by the inmates. John grew increasingly frustrated with how everything had turned out. Nelson, however, expressed gratitude, thanking John for preparing him for life in prison. John's revenge plan had completely fallen apart. The next day was Nelson's parole hearing. To prepare for the big day, Nelson was assisted by his new friend, Barry. John entered their cell and handed Nelson a farewell gift, an already opened soda can, wishing him luck at the hearing. Suspicious, Nelson hesitated, but John pretended to be offended. To prove his innocence, John took a sip. Nelson apologized and drank the rest of the soda, only to collapse moments later. John, gagging from the small sip he had taken, vomited in the toilet. With the help of an accomplice, he carried Nelson's unconscious body away. The following day, at the parole hearing, Nelson appeared, unaware that the words "white power" were written across his forehead. The committee immediately denied his release. Nelson lashed out at his cellmate, attacking him during a fight. Under pressure, the cellmate admitted that all the hostility was because of Nelson's father, the judge. Guard Shanahan, annoyed that the inmates had a fight without him, reminded everyone that he organized the fight schedule. He declared they would settle their issues with a death match on Friday in the yard. The loser would die, and Shanahan would kill the winner himself. To maintain order, a supervisor was assigned to monitor the fight. Other inmates eagerly placed bets on gruesome outcomes, such as skull fractures or ears being bitten off. Nelson also received a visit from Barry, who had been deemed reformed by the parole board, thanks entirely to Nelson. However, Barry confessed that he couldn't be happy without Nelson, calling him his fish. Barry offered to help Nelson escape, but Nelson refused, saying,
"I'll only leave this place in a body bag."
Barry, in tears, suggested,
"Then let's make a body bag for two."
Nelson devised a plan. He contacted Dwayne and revealed that if he stayed in prison, he would transfer control of his father's foundation to his son, who would run it until Nelson's release. To execute this, Nelson adopted a fellow inmate. Meanwhile, the prison warden learned of the death match and placed a $50 bet on Nelson, the newcomer. On Friday, the yard was packed as inmates cheered for the fight. The rules were simple. The first to die loses. Nelson armed himself with a screwdriver, while his opponent came more prepared. A shiv was thrown into the crowd, and another broke against Nelson's improvised body armor. Finally, both fighters resorted to their secret weapons, syringes filled with brightly colored chemicals. Nelson landed a fatal blow, but his opponent managed to strike him in return. Shanahan declared it a tie and ordered the bodies to be removed before they start stinking. Nelson was buried, leaving his adopted son as the sole heir to an $8 million fortune. However, Barry refused to leave the cemetery. That evening, he dug up Nelson's grave with a shovel. Earlier, Nelson had obtained a special chemical from the prison chemist to put himself into a coma. Barry had bribed the coroner to ensure the plan worked. As Nelson prepared to leave, Barry reminded him of their agreement to rescue John, saying,
"If it weren't for that jerk, we'd never have met."
With that, they settled their differences. A year later, Barry and Nelson opened a winery called Duckling. However, their wine wasn't exactly a hit. When one critic gave it a bad review, John and some former inmates, now working at the winery, intimidated him. The critic promised to give the wine a perfect score of 100, even though the bitter concoction with a hint of ammonia was disliked by everyone, including the winemakers themselves. That's all for today's video. Don't forget to show your support if you enjoyed it by hit that like and subscribe button. See you in the comments and in the next one.